But let me start by talking about the importance of Stalin. And I think the best way to get at this is a little bit of autobiography, a little bit about how I came to do this work. I was raised in a family where my father was a Republican, my mother was a Democrat, and I, was paid no more than average attention to politics and was not particularly aware of the importance of politics. And then, when I was in graduate school, the Vietnam War escalated tremendously. American government sent a couple of 100,000 troops to Vietnam. I got involved in Suits for Democratic Society, and I was opposed to the Vietnam War. I wasn't clear at that time why exactly I was opposed to it. Looking back on that, I think I was very naive, but I just thought that it was wrong for such a large, powerful country like the United States to be making war on a small, basically non-industrial society in Asia, Southeast Asia, and I really didn't know any more than that. So I was involved in the anti-war movement here in New York City. That's where I met my friend Tony Bonovich, who's sitting over here. We were involved together back in those days. And I was at a demonstration one day, and I believe it was in Central Park, and it may have even been the Sheep Meadow, and where there were just hundreds of thousands of people. And somebody was walking by, a group of people were walking by carrying a Viet Cong flag, and I thought to myself, maybe that's what I should be doing because they're the ones who are actually fighting. And then somebody that day said to me, someone said to me, and I don't remember who it was, said to me, you really ought not to be opposing the American war in Vietnam. And I said, why not? And that person said, well, because the opposing side, the National Liberation Front, was really controlled by and run by the Communist Party of Vietnam. And the Communist Party of Vietnam was formed and was still led by Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh studied under Joseph Stalin, and Stalin killed 20 million people. So you really shouldn't be fighting against the American war in Vietnam. And I thought about that, and I realized that I didn't know anything about any of these issues, and that at some point or other I should look into that question. I should really investigate what was behind all of this that exposed to me my ignorance. Well, racing ahead a little bit, in 1968 a book came out by Robert Conquest, a British-American researcher, called The Great Terror, about 800 pages long in its original edition, and I read it. And it was horrifying, it made Stalin out to be a monster, a mass murderer, a tremendous criminal, and it had lots and lots of documentation, mainly from Russian sources, although a lot of other sources too. And I also filed that away in the back of my mind, and I said, when I have time, I'm going to look into this. I'm going to check to see what the truth is about this matter. Well, I got a job teaching at Montclair State, and I worked on my PhD, and other things were going on. But eventually, I had the time, and I always had the motivation, and I started to look into this. And I read a few book reviews of some books that Conquest cited, and I saw that the reviews by, mainstream, basically anti-communist scholars, did not think much of these books that Conquest cited. So I decided to go further, and for many weeks, I guess for several years, when I had the time, I would take the bus from New Jersey to Port Authority and walk a few blocks and go to the New York Public Library, which has an excellent Slavic collection. And I would just request the books and articles that Conquest cited, and I would look at them to see whether they supported what Conquest said they supported. And I did this over a long period of time, and I found that they virtually never did. Either they said something else completely, or Conquest had sort of cherry-picked certain quotations out of context. I ended up having a file box with 3x5 file cards. They're this size. And now every single one of them I made a note of a source that Robert Conquest cited in that book, The Great Terror, and the pages he cited, and then I would go check these at the New York Public Library. By the way, that was in the middle 1970s now. I had thought that material was all lost, and then last year, my daughter asked me to come clean out some of your stuff that's all stored in my attic, because she now owns the house that I raised my kids in. And I was cleaning out the stuff, and my God, there it was. I thought that it was long lost. And I looked at it, and I threw it away, because I'm not really interested in conquest anymore. But it reminded me that I really had done all that work. So that stimulated my curiosity. I realized that Conquest's work, which is very, very widely praised and published in many, many languages, millions of copies, tremendously influential, was fundamentally a fraud. I decided I would try to, in between everything else, do a little bit of research on this, and I decided that this is in the late 1970s. There was probably more information available about the military purges, sometimes called the Tukhachevsky affair, than anything else. And I spent a fair amount of time researching and getting all of the material available about the Tukhachevsky affair there. The Tukhachevsky affair was the purges of the military commanders in 1937 in the Soviet Union, and the universally accepted truth at that time, as well as today, is that Stalin had all these military commanders killed either out of paranoia or insanity or because he was jealous of them for some reason or other, but they were basically innocent of collaborating with the Germans and Japanese and of plotting to overthrow the government. That's still the story today. And I did some research on this, and I came to conclusions that the research that had been done up till that time was really inconclusive. It really couldn't prove anything much. And I eventually got this published with a great deal of difficulty in a Soviet Studies type journal in 1987. And that's where things kind of sat for quite a long time. Well, along came the internet. And I said, oh, this is great, I'm going to make my own web page. And one of the things I did was retype that article. And I retyped it, and I put it on my web page. And a couple of years later, I was contacted by a gentleman named Vladimir Bobrov in Moscow, who said, well, I want you to know that your article is the best article that's ever been written on the Tukhachevsky affair, but it's seriously out of date because now a lot of documents have been released from the former Soviet archives, and we know a lot more. We could know a lot more if we studied them, and I would like to enlist your help to study them. So Vladimir and I started this process, and in fact, he did write an article, and I have also a whole book. It's on my hard drive. I never got around to finishing it for reasons I'll explain now. And starting to plunge into this avalanche, really, of documents, the primary source documents from the former Soviet archives that came out, I started to discover a lot of things, and one of the things I discovered led me to write a two-part article, which was published in 2005, called Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform. What I discovered, and there's excellent documentary primary source evidence for this, is that far from being a dictator and autocrat, Stalin was very concerned to return the political power in the Soviet Union to the Soviets and to get the party out of directly ruling the Soviet Union and to create an elective or representative system, which of course wouldn't be permitted to overthrow socialism, but nevertheless would empower the population in a way that had not been done up to that time. So I realized this was a very important result, which is known only to a fairly small number of people in Russia, where some research had been done on that. And I wrote this article. It really didn't, therefore, represent any of my research, but really my popularizing or making available to a non-Russian speaking audience, to an English-reading audience, some research that others had done in Russian. I published that. In the process of all of this, I ran across some data, some documents in the archives among the materials that were being published in book form and that I was beginning to order from Russia in Russian. Some evidence that proved that at least in a couple of instances, Nikita Khrushchev was not telling the truth in his famous speech to the 20th Party Congress in 1956, where he attacked Stalin and, again called him a monster and an autocrat and a dictator and a murderer and so forth and so on, said he ruled by terror. I decided I would write up an article. I thought I could do this. Write up an article and prove 3 or 4 or 5 lies that Khrushchev made in this speech. And I thought that would make a nice article, and that, I would submit it to a Soviet studies journal perhaps, and everybody would say, oh, that's great. We discovered a couple of lies that Khrushchev made, and that's very good. And that was my plan, but what happened was that every additional statement or allegation or accusation of Khrushchev's that I began to study, I found that each one of them could be disproven by reference to documents that had been published since the end of the Soviet Union. So I decided to take the whole speech. At first I divided it up into 32 different assertions, but later I went back and decided there were more of them, and I eventually ended up deciding that there were 61 charges or allegations or accusations against both Stalin and Beria that Khrushchev made in that speech. And I investigated every single one of them in the light of the evidence that we now have from the former least secret Soviet archives that have been published either in article or in book form. And I discovered that I could prove that 60 of them were false, and the 61st I couldn't prove one way or the other. And I wrote a book which was not initially published in English, but was published in Russian, because my colleague, really invaluable co-worker here, Vladimir Bobrov in Moscow, said, this is very important, we should set aside the Tukhachevsky stuff, let me translate this, and he's a master of Russian as well as of English. He translated that, and we got it published in 2007 by a major Russian publishing house, which never paid us a cent like they promised to do, because they're capitalists, but that wasn't really what we were out for anyway. And it sold, within a couple of years, it sold like 13,000 copies, and for a heavily documented scholarly book in any country, that's pretty surprising. For Russia, that really is more than surprising. It's amazing. But of course, Khrushchev's secret speech is a big deal in Russia. They teach it in the schools, Here, probably nobody ever reads it. Very, very seldom. But in Russia, they do read it. They are kind of made to read it. So it got on to